You're listening to a podcast from the University of Manchester.
Today in the studio we're talking to Sarah Littlejohn, who is Head of Campus Life within the Directorate of Student Experience here at the University of Manchester. Sarah is an experienced psychotherapist, trainer and supervisor with specialist training in cognitive analytic therapy. She has over 25 years' experience of working with students in the higher education sector and has spent much of her career at the university, where she has led on the development of the sector-leading Greater Manchester University Student Mental Health Service. Prior to becoming Head of Campus Life, Sarah was Head of the Counselling Service and Mental Health Services at the university for over 10 years. Sarah joins us today to talk about what we're doing to help support student mental health as part of our series of podcasts to mark World Mental Health Day. So Sarah, many thanks for talking to us today. You have a long career in supporting mental health. What do you think has changed over the last few years in terms of demand for support services?
Well, I suppose, as is often covered in the media, people will be aware there's been a significant increase in the demand for support services in universities. And I think on the one hand, this does probably reflect a growing need for services, an increase in mental health difficulties in the population, but also perhaps it reflects an increasing openness and preparedness to talk about difficulties and seek support. So it's a mixed picture. On the one hand, it reflects difficulty, and on the other, perhaps a reduction in stigma.
Why is mental health support so important for this age group of 18 to 24-year-olds?
So 18 to 24 is an age of vulnerability for first onset of a number of mental illnesses. And so the age at which students are often undergraduate at university is also the age when they may well struggle with the first experiences of mental health difficulties. So we know that key mental illnesses around depression or eating disorders and so on often occur first off in that age group. And so not only is it important because we want to be able to respond to our students when they're in difficulty, but also because we know that in a sense it's a public health opportunity. We've got all these young people in one place, and we want to be able to meet the needs of those young people as they move through that developmental window.
It was announced at the end of last year that Greater Manchester will be the first place in the country to establish a dedicated centre to help support higher education students with mental health needs. Can you tell us a bit more about what this new centre will offer?
Yeah, so it's a really exciting initiative. It's a partnership between all the universities of Greater Manchester. So that's the University of Manchester, MMU, Salford, Bolton and RNCM, together with the devolved authority of Greater Manchester and the NHS. So this partnership's worked over the last 18 months to 2 years to develop this new service, which is aimed at students with significant mental health difficulties. If support is a pyramid or a triangle, it's at the top quadrant of that triangle. It's a physical service with its hub at the heart of the campus and with spokes or clinics in Bolton and in Salford. It's staffed by a mix of mental health nurses and clinical psychologists, and we'll have a consultant psychiatrist in the service as well. And it's a sector-leading approach, really, to answer the question of how do we help students get the mental health support they need when their difficulties perhaps are too significant for the in-house services within the universities, but where students struggle to access NHS services as they're currently configured. So in-house counselling and mental health services within each of the universities will be able to refer directly into that new service.
And when will this new centre, is it actually open now or is it due to open?
Well, the paint's drying, I think, is where we are.
Right.
It's been handed over to the NHS staff who are going to work there, and they're beginning to take the first referrals from the in-house services. It's probably going to be up and running properly within the next 2 or 3 weeks.
And how will students access those services? Will they need to still be referred there?
So the way students will gain access is through being assessed within the counselling and mental health service, for example, at the University of Manchester. And if their needs are significant enough that they need more help than can be offered within that service, within the existing service, and where an NHS service isn't available for them in a timely manner, then they may well get a referral into that service. It's a pilot, it's 2 years, and one of the things we're going to have to establish is can we work as a partnership to manage the referral process sufficiently well that students experience it as a seamless pathway? So they're not having to be assessed in our service and then assessed in the new service and then put on a waiting list, which is often the experience at the moment. So for those students who are struggling with significant mental illness, we're hoping that they'll experience a much less fractured and fragmented service where they can access the in-house help, be assessed there, and then stepped into this new service to receive the treatment that they need.
Do you see this as like a collaborative approach, working with the NHS on this as well? Do you see maybe the NHS referring students to this service as well?
Well, I suppose one of the things we've got to really work hard at in the pilot is to make sure that the capacity of the service isn't overstretched. And so it's got to be a very managed referral pathway.
Right,
so we couldn't
I see.
open it up for all NHS services to refer in.
I see.
Because that would immediately create the problem we're trying to avoid, which is waiting times. The referral pathway is through existing in-house services because we're best placed to understand the needs of the student. But yeah, it is a really collaborative provision, and that's why it's sector leading. Universities across the country are trying to figure out how can we offer the support we need to our students and how do we engage the NHS and work with the NHS so that there isn't a kind of a big gap between the provision we offer and where the NHS picks up. And because of the devolved health budget that GM Greater Manchester has, they've been able to work with universities to develop this innovative approach. And there's a lot of interest across the sector to see if it can be stood up elsewhere. But, we're, I guess, going to wait and see the results of the pilot because we've got 2 years to establish, well, does this work and does it work sufficiently well, both in terms of student experience of the service, but also in terms of outcomes for students. And I guess over that 18 months, 2 years, that's what we'll be trying to establish and evaluate.
Starting university, it's an exciting experience, but it's also quite stressful and brings with it new challenges. Do you think there are more pressures for students today?
Yeah, I think it's a really different landscape, isn't it, in all the ways that we know about financially, with fees. There's been huge changes in the education system prior to university, and some might argue increased pressure at those points. And then there's the wider social issues of social media, the fear of missing out and all of those things that come with that. So I think things are different, and certainly it's true that, as we've talked about before, there's increasing demand. We're also aware that anxiety for the first time has overtaken low mood as the most common presenting problem, and that perhaps does reflect an increased sense of pressure. On the other hand, 18-year-olds perhaps now are in many ways the same as they were all those years ago when I was 18, 19, because some of the developmental kind of struggles are still the same. They're trying to establish their autonomy. They're going through all the developmental hurdles. Brains are still adolescent till mid-20s in terms of their development. So that hasn't changed. And I think perhaps what has changed as well is the universities have become much more attuned to those developmental challenges and hurdles and the implicit psychological curriculum that runs alongside the academic curriculum. We're aware that for undergraduates, the typical, if you like, undergraduate, they are growing up whilst at university as well as getting a degree. And so I think support and what support means in our eyes has changed over the last couple of decades.
The Division of Campus Life has a number of innovative resources available to students. For example, there's an online resource on settling into university, which kind of looks at coping and resilience, well-being and belonging. Do you think resources such as this are key to helping students in the first instance?
Yes, I think all of the online provision is a hugely important kind of adjunct to kind of human contact. I don't think any of us would want to visualise it or to think of it as a replacement for that. When you talk to students and any of the surveys that are done, one of the findings that comes out again and again for students is feelings of loneliness or difficulty with feeling that they belong. So, and that really needs to be responded to by the availability of connection of people, both with their peers and with staff. So I don't think we'd want to see it as an alternative to, but certainly as an adjunct. And for young people, getting help and sourcing information online is absolutely second nature. So we need to meet that and provide online resources that are agile and interesting and engaging. But at the same time, we also want to reassure them that behind the online resources and alongside them, there are people who are interested in their support as well.
These initiatives are sort of aimed at first-year students. How do we keep that momentum of support going as students progress through their university career to their second and third years?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the resource that you're referring to is the e-learning resource that we sent out to all new students this year.
Yeah.
And the plan is that we make a new iteration, a new version of that for the transition into year 2 and then another one into year 3, and also postgraduate who are part of that student journey. And I guess that's what we'll be working on in the coming months and year ahead. Because at each point of transition, students face similar difficulties, increased anxiety, high levels of uncertainty, having to gear up for a new challenge, and some of the high hopes that go with that, and also some of the fears. So I guess we're looking to scaffold and support the transitional period as they go through each progression into the new years and beyond that into employability or further study.
You're launching a donor-funded support product as part of World Mental Health Day. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is a product called Big White Wall, and it's an online peer support platform, but it's moderated and supported by trained counsellors.
Oh, right.
So it's both a platform where peer-to-peer support can take place, but it's also got a lot of information and also online groups that are moderated. So it's 24/7, which is the really key thing about it. And it's real people at the end of it. It's not a bot. And so for students who, as an addition to face-to-face support or before face-to-face support, or for some instead of it, we think it's going to be a really useful resource. We're really pleased that it's been supported by a donation, and we're piloting it for a year to see what the usage is and see whether it does meet a need. And we think that the quality of the resources that are in there and also the provision of this peer-to-peer support that's moderated means that students, 2:00 in the morning or 8:00 at night when the face-to-face services are closed will be able to reach out and have a really useful response, and also can work their way through a kind of curriculum of these online psychoeducational groups across a huge range of issues and equip themselves with some of that kind of psychological self-knowledge, which is so useful in self-managing their difficulties or their struggles. So that's launching, as you say, on World Mental Health Day, and there's going to be communication around that to draw people's attention to it. And then we're going to repeat that comms across the year to see whether we can generate, the usage of it and that it becomes a useful resource.
And is the idea that would people volunteer to be a peer support?
So this is a national product, and lots of universities already have it, as does the NHS and other providers. And so the peers, if you like, are the national community of users. So you might be in a chat with somebody who's in London or Scotland.
Oh, I see.
And your geographical location doesn't matter because you're all talking about this issue.
Right.
And as I say, because it's moderated very cleverly with the use of some clever technology in the background and which flags any issues which perhaps are too significant for peer-to-peer support. And then it has the facility for these trained moderators to step in and enter into one-to-one conversations with individuals. So it's both really useful and really safe.
And this is a resource that's available to staff, isn't it?
Big White Wall is available to staff and students. And as I was saying, the community, if you like, the peer community that offers the support isn't just restricted to students. It's offered through the NHS and other providers. So there's a wide range of age groups and demographics on there. So yes, it's available to staff. All of the groups, the online groups, would also be available to staff. And all you'll need is a University of Manchester email address to register.
There's also a project that supports students in private rented accommodation. For example, key rings and fridge magnets that have the details of mental health support services on them. I mean, that's a very simple idea, but I would think it's very effective. And we have such a large student population here in Manchester. Students are not always in halls of residence, they are scattered about, large parts of the city. So is part of this thinking about different ways to reach them?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The scale is often the challenge, and trying to make sure that people have the right information at the right time. This again was supported by a donation, which we feel very fortunate to have had. And it just puts the information literally in somebody's pocket on their key ring or on the fridge where it's very visible. And these are things that have a long life. The fridge magnet stays in the property, the keys get handed to the new tenant. And so we've put some key information about support services, both online and phone services, so that in the moment of need, the information is there. We've already had feedback about it being used in that way with students in a period of crisis and not having to Google or scroll through their phone to find out what's available, but just knowing there it is. And there's also something about just the awareness of support being available can in and of itself reduce people's sense of loneliness or distress. So knowing that on your key ring there are those numbers, you may not call them, but the fact that you know they're there can actually provide some support to people, because the idea that they're living in a community where support exists actually helps people feel that sense of support.
Well, I suppose it's that kind of just that little bit of connection as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
That you could be living a mile away from the campus or whatever, but that it's something tangible and physical that gives you that connection really to what support is available.
Absolutely. And also for friends to be able to say to their flatmates, look, there's that number, on our key rings, and I know you're struggling, maybe we should call it.
Yeah.
So it helps peers also feel a little bit more empowered to offer the support that's needed.
In what ways can we as staff reach out to students when so much of our contact now is via email rather than face-to-face?
Yeah, it's a real challenge, isn't it, with all the efficiency that email and other kinds of electronic communication bring, to also be available as a person. I guess the overall message that we try and get across is that every contact counts, whether it's the smile from the building porter or the how's it going from the academic advisor. Across the whole gamut of staff, there are many, many opportunities for students to feel seen and recognised. So I guess I'd encourage us all to continue to do that, to be a welcoming, open and warm kind of response. And I suppose some of the principles around trying to solve the problem that's in front of you with the student rather than sending them away and to find the answer somewhere else. I mean, I think, the University of Manchester does really well on that. I think we've got really engaged staff, and I feel like we're all united in that determination for students to feel connected. It is an ongoing challenge in a big university, in a big city. And we do know that students can struggle to feel a sense of connection and belonging. So I think it's just to keep our eyes open for those opportunities to make that connection with students.
There's also a course available for staff who want to find out more about student mental health support, and that's whether they're an academic, they work in security or residences, any number of roles across the university. How can this be accessed?
Yes, there's a range of, firstly, online training, which people can access from the Supporting Students page of StaffNet. It's also available on the Counselling Service web pages. There's currently a couple of online trainings. One is a kind of first contact e-learning, which helps staff think about how to be useful to students in that first support contact, as you say, whatever your role. And then there's another, perhaps more specific, video-based training on how to respond to students with more significant mental health difficulties and what useful responses there might be. So I'd encourage all staff to take a look at those resources. In addition to that, there are some face-to-face trainings. There's a monthly responding to students in crisis training run by a mental health nurse from the Counselling Service. Again, open to all staff, helping staff think about how they can be useful in a mental health crisis in a kind of first aid kind of a way. So the dates for that are on the Counselling Service website. And there's also a Managing Difficult Interactions training, and the dates for that are also there. And that's for staff with student-facing roles to reflect on interactions they've had, conversations they've had, and how they might want to think about those and manage them differently if they've perhaps felt challenged in those interactions, so on, and helping staff develop the skills they need in those areas.
Well, that's really useful to know, and I'm sure many staff will want to access those resources and be interested to find out more, because I think, the more that we're empowered to kind of face these situations and to help where we can, it's on a large campus such as ours, I think it's, like you say, it can be that first point of contact that could just make all the difference, really.
Yes, and we know that's the case. Students, will often say that, they had a feedback we get, for example, for residential staff in halls, cleaners and porters and receptionists. Students will very often feed back how important those brief conversations or that warm smile was. So we know the small things matter.
Yeah.
And it's just really important for us to take those opportunities when we can.
And finally, what are the best recommendations you think for looking after our own mental health, whether that's as a student or a member of staff?
Well, I guess slightly counterintuitively, I think, there's a number of things I'd say, but I think the first thing I'd say is that accepting struggle is normal is probably the kind of the most important thing. I think people come to university and are very often told and very often hope it's going to be, the best years of their life, and it's going to be a really fantastic experience, and we hope it is. But within that, there are going to be kind of other notes in the melody, and they will be times of struggle or disappointment, loneliness, anxiety, and these are all absolutely normal. And I think very often students can feel worried about the fact that they're not, that they're struggling for periods. So I think as staff and as students to accept that struggle is normal, and that seeking help is normal, and that it's to be welcomed. I think that's the first thing. And then I suppose alongside that, there's the 6 Ways to Wellbeing framework that at the university we use as a way of talking about how all of us, with small and quite ordinary changes in our behaviour, can support our own mental well-being. And it's evidence-based. It's grouped around 6 themes that we know from the research really do support our mental well-being. And it's around connection and around self-care and so on. And information about that is on the Supporting Students website, and there are campaigns run on that through the year. And if I can just remember, I might even be able to remember the 6, although I may get caught out here. But I think it's around connection, around being active, around giving, around taking notice, around learning and discovering, and around being healthy and safe. And there's 6 themes. If you spend a moment reflecting on which bits you're more active in than others, can just give you a little bit of a nudge towards paying attention to the areas perhaps you're less focused on. So those are my 2 tips. Struggle's normal, and look after your well-being in these simple ways that you're nudged towards on the student support website.
Well, thanks very much for joining us today, Sarah. I think you've highlighted, what's happening at the university, what the university is doing to support student mental health in particular. And I think it's also highlighted as well the resources that are available to staff. So thank you very much for joining us today, Sarah.
Thank you.
If you are a university student or staff member seeking support, please call the counselling service on 0161 275 2864. You can also find information about mental health support and online resources, including training for staff, at counsellingservice.manchester.ac.uk. If you have been affected by any of the issues raised in this podcast, you can call the Samaritans 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on 116 123.